I want to express my thanks before I start to Carol, Deborah, Paige, Bethany, and Napua and Angela, who helped me eat some haupia before this, and everyone at Shangri-La who worked to make this salon talk happen. I'm grateful to be here, and I will signal to you if I need more haupia. So, I understand there are varying backgrounds today, and I will try to speak to all levels. We're surrounded in here, all around us, by the fruit of painstaking, assiduous preservation. Today I want to talk about something that's not quite preservation, but where preservation, and preservation in particular of Muslim cultural heritage, becomes flashpoint. We're not exactly sitting in a space where it is a flashpoint, where it becomes a kind of site of deep friction, an object of contestation between worlds and ideas, between monumental forms, between liberalism and multiple sects of Islam, and between forms of Islam themselves, some of which then self-identify as liberal or not. And finally, about the role of visual material culture in that meeting place between them. What of the living human landscapes of and in Islamic art and architecture? You can see a tomb here with tracks in front of it. And that's my theme today. What of them, especially in the context of preservation and conservation? What about when the living piece clashes with the conservation piece? Then what? What to privilege? What is primary? And what of them when they, the people, the life orbiting around the aesthetic treasure, are a fundamental piece of the meaning of the aesthetic? Can you see the Where's Waldo here? To what degree are they part of the value of treasures of cultural heritage, even when to the public they're messy, smelly, unruly? To what degree are the sites and their material treasures something else altogether without that, without the human element? Take the architecture of the shrine, and I didn't choose a high shrine for this first image. An Islamic aesthetic itself built to serve an ever-changing population of indigent poor. Sorry, I had to do this. India is full of kind of sudden humor. Should the poor in a certain space that is also a space that should be preserved, themselves be preserved and conserved, or only the object itself? And if they are part of it, should they be preserved in a way pleasing to the viewer? Think of some of the complicated aspects of the Polynesian Cultural Center, for example. Or should they be left as is? Is there a happy medium? Are the living part of the object? I do not think that the artifacts from around the world in here, and the concordant euphony or synthesis of artifacts and artisanship to create a space here, are not lived in an unusual way. Indeed, a lot of human life flows through these walls. Some or many of these treasures of material culture, however, were enjoyed in their own context in very complicated and varied ways. Some by the rich, some by the poor, and some by a mix. But in their places, as in the one I want to look at, many or most Islamic cultural treasures are not dead, but are living and lived in and on. So then what do we make of the place of and for those humans inside the space? The beloved saint's tomb I wish to discuss today is cherished by such a mix of rich and poor. But above all, it's a place beloved to, for, and because of beggars. Can you imagine if Shangri-La was a place beloved to, for, and because of beggars? Would everybody that comes here every day still come here? Maybe not. But why, you might ask, in this particular site, because of? We don't want to have to pick between preservation and culture, conservation and life. As sensible, thinking people, we want to say, why not both? Is that hard? I'll start by introducing the setting, and I'll come back to these questions. So, this is Delhi. This is the Delhi that I know. It's not necessarily the Delhi that everybody sees. I've had a long working and very personal engagement with it for a long time. If you've been there, you know it is a space of extremes and extreme poverty, where new and old mix in startling ways, where the country is in the city, where things are changing too fast to make sense of, where people live absolutely wherever they can find to live, and I mean absolutely, even say on 4, 5, 6,000-year-old walls of the city's oldest ramparts. And this is also Delhi. Here again. Doris Duke was there, as you know, or you may not. She was, I think, especially taken with the jollies, the lattices so essentially part of the shrines I am talking about too. Also, Doris Duke's architect Blomfeld was Delhi-based. The lattices give this house here at Shangri-La a lot of its special character. So Delhi itself is here, inside these walls around you right now. In Delhi, as in so much of northern South Asia, the line between Islam and Hinduism, and between Islam and other religions that it came into dialogue with, is very thin, especially at sites of Sufi devotion. Just in case you don't know, Sufism is a mystical strain of Islam, or I should say strains. This is Fatehpur Sikri. Doris was at Fatehpur also, and it's just such a tomb as I want to show you today, but less busy. I'm trying to draw a connection between where we're sitting and what I'm talking about, so I'll keep on telling you. Fatehpur's patron saint was a man named Salim Chishti, a member of the Silsila, or chain of Chishti Sufis. After Akbar had the male child, that's the Mughal emperor, for whose conception he had sought Chishti's blessings, he had the city built in gratitude around the desert site at which Salim Chishti performed his austerities, and from which he taught. Now, trace that Chishti train far enough back, and you'll get to the foundational saint buried right here, Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia, just Nizamuddin for short. Just keep this image in mind for a bit. You can look at it and see what's going on, maybe even try to guess what's going on. A couple generations further back, and you'd get to another foundational figure, Muinuddin Chishti, essential in bringing the line to the subcontinent. Muinuddin was kind of Nizamuddin's spiritual grandpa. As for lines between Hinduism and Islam, that's a big deal here. That line is really in some ways thinnest in the sacred sites of this particular Sufi order. Hindus worship here at this shrine and receive alms and food and are welcomed. By contrast, Muslims only rarely visit Hindu temples. The saint himself, Nizamuddin, and his predecessors, Qutubuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki and Muinuddin Chishti, famously welcomed the poor of all faiths, and this tradition continued for a long time, or continues to the present day. In fact, Muinuddin was called Gharib Nawaz, the protector or champion of the poor. They're still all here, those poor, still listening to the injunctions that were uttered 800 or 900 years ago about them. So here again, Nizamuddin's tomb. I'll talk about the eclecticism of this space in a minute. Nizamuddin was a foundational saint in the order. He was born in 1236. He preached and taught from here and was very explicit about this welcoming across religions and of the poor, and about feeding the poor, about how little it matters who you are, how it's more fun to give away than to accumulate. At the time, this spot in Delhi was the village of Riazpur. The village grew around him and around the beggars and pilgrims that came to see him. So from its very inception, it is almost formed around the process of begging. And it grew and grew until the walls became the forest all around and a private boat sailed by for Max. And when the city enveloped the village, where the wild things no longer were, it remained an enclave orbiting around the pole of the saint whose magnetic presence was seen to remain at his tomb and shrine. So when someone comes as a pilgrim to one of these spots, they don't feel like they're visiting the tomb of Thomas Jefferson. They feel like Thomas Jefferson is there, pervading things. They feel like the saint is present. Today, as before, it is a numinous place, a most sacred pilgrimage site, and a center for beggars. Around the shrine are many other treasures of cultural heritage. The tomb of the poet Mirza Ghalib, for example, a 19th century Urdu poet. A tomb called the Nila Gumbad, the tomb of the 20th century saint Hazrat Inayat Khan, who had an epiphany in Holland and strove to bring Sufism to the West, alongside a trove of other medieval architectural treasures and modern architectural treasures. How can I describe, though, what it feels like in here? The righteous noise, the mess of life in the walls. Has anybody in here been there? One is surrounded by hawkers, beggars, urchins, blaring devotional music, butchers letting blood into the street, devotees, tourists, addicts, pilgrims, shoe takers, fanners cooling visitors, people in tragedy and trouble, people in trance and ecstasy. And a lot of people turn around before they get all the way to the tomb. Inside is a grand complex, at the center of which is the tomb. Here's a schematic. At the sides are offices, actually, acting offices of various descendants of the saints holding various functions, tombs and graves of minor figures associated with the saint, the shrine of the poet Amir Khusro, a saint in his own right, to whom is attributed the birth of Qawwali devotional music, which was playing as you walked in, to which one is whisked in upon stepping into the shrine enclosure itself. Come to our shrine first. Then the sanctum, the tomb itself, only open to men. But an aside, I once saw a really remarkable phenomenon in which men would go into the tomb, take pictures of the tomb, and then they would give the phone to the women waiting outside, and then the women themselves would kiss the phone as the men did with the shrine inside. There is one Chishti shrine that's an exception to the gendered rule in the sanctum, and it's the tomb of the greatest of the order at Ajmer Muinuddin Chishti. Women and men may both go into the sanctum. That's in eastern Rajasthan, northeastern Rajasthan. Another 2-second aside, just to say here in the right place to say it, that the vernacular saint's tomb as shrine in Islam really deserves its own talk, its own book, its own 10 books, and it's an amazing site for local creativity and variation and incorporation of local tradition, not all of that tradition Islamic. Though the dargah, or ziyarat, or mazar as a form only sometimes appears in treatments of classical art, it may itself be a piece, or it definitely is a piece of the aesthetic corpus. Emperors and sultans sought the dargah as saints' blessings to legitimate their conquests, reigns, and campaigns, to sanctify their weddings, to bring them children or healing or solace. And for that reason also, some of these dargahs in the most ordinary places were the object of patronage. So they received the gift of marble or the gift of construction and became these enormous complex. Over time, a lot of these kings and queens were very superstitious. And they really wanted to say someone to say to them, "You're doing the right thing, don't worry, and you're going to have another son who's going to be your heir, I promise." And so if those things happened and they were in fact doing the right thing, chances were they could come back the next year and build a nice marble wall. But things such as this weren't part of that high tradition either. That's in Tajikistan, by the way. Nizamuddin's tomb complex also has its own particular aesthetic wealth. Fantastic jolly screens, mirror inlaid sanctum. Now, inside that mirror adorned sanctum itself, here is what happens in circumambulation, weeping, placing of garlands and shrouds upon and kissing the tomb, and praying in the manner of dua, effervescent, ecstatic worship. For a more formalized ritual, one goes to a mosque inside the enclosure where scheduled salat prayers are held. But the whole neighborhood is full of architectural jewels. Then there are the services for the poor, what we might call an Islamic sacred humanitarian architecture, consisting of the plinth upon which sits the deir, the sacred cauldron to feed the poor, inside the langar, the charitable kitchen. In this and other great shrines, sometimes at the end of the almsgiving, poor children are invited to dive to the bottom of the great cauldron to fetch the auspicious dregs, and money, as you can see, and maybe some microbes along the way. This is for the quiz later. Carol, do you have the quiz to hand out? I'm just kidding. You know, I thought about actually putting that on the slide, and then I thought, maybe if I put that on the slide, you'll think that I used this in the classroom for a classroom lecture. But I didn't. Actually, it's auspicious. The beggar's presence is auspicious for the giver and the receiver, and that points to something else. The beggars, who are, as you will hear, among the features of the space taken to be most unsightly, are an elemental, profoundly important part of the pilgrim's experience. What if they are removed from it in favor of preservation? You might wonder, why are beggars such a big deal here? As a 15th century observer, Simnani said, the Chishtiya, quote, aim at poverty and denial, and they keep company with the poor and beggars, giving them food. All of which points to a complex relationship of Indo-Islamic traditions, and indeed Sufistic traditions more widely, and poverty. A relationship cemented by Sufism and incarnate in art, aesthetics, and other features of the lived surface of things. But that is perhaps rarely attested in museum halls or collections. In India, a treasure of cultural heritage may be the dustiest, craziest, most passionately inhabited of spaces. It might also be a point of contestation and friction, a matter of life and death, and a site at which self and community are themselves negotiated. And yet, fighting for control of this hotspot space are parties that eschew this intimacy, and others yet that want to transform the space into something else altogether. And it's a little remarkable, something more exclusively focused on preservation and conservation. The various parties in this all kind of want to win, to have their unique vision prevailing at day's end. And who will win? So all this is leading up to what is most interesting here, which is that the shrine has become a flashpoint for different ideas of Islam, of city, and of heritage. There's a new vision for the shrine's future, more in line with the culture park, and the glitzy city Delhi wants to be, but isn't yet, and might never be. Let me start with laying out for you who's here and what they want. They're the shrine managers themselves, descendants of the saints charged with management and revenue, who more or less want the fabric of this place to carry on as it always has. These guys are always here, just kind of hanging about. They're the established neighborhood residents. There are the neighborhood poor, beggars, slum dwellers, Bangladeshi migrants living in concrete pipes. Now enter the preachers, the agents of what is perhaps the world's largest Muslim network. Providing a stark counterpoint to the Sufis here are the revivalist Tabligis, who reject the syncretism, Hindu friendliness, esoteric, syncretic, eclectic ways we see in the shrine and its adherents' patent practices, from incorporating Hindu symbols to working with trance healing, from music to praying to a saint. The Tabligis reject all that. They are what are sometimes called fundamentalists. Starting in the time of British Empire, these in particular pushed, especially in the face of the British, to return to Islamic basics through witnessing, preaching stories of the prophets, and modeling life on them in a kind of pay-it-forward way. You got your life changed? Tell 10 more people and you'll start ratcheting up the righteousness. Explicitly, the Tablighi are pacifists, actually. They reject worldly politics and violence, but they've been entangled in a number of fraught movements from the Taliban to Kashmir, partially because they have influenced those movements so strongly. The notion of resetting a radically changing society to something that is back to basics. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The Aga Khan Foundation is the charitable wing of the Ismaili Muslim community, and its 49th Imam, the 4th Aga Khan. This community is the opposite of what we call fundamentalist. In essence, they believe doctrine is flexible and can only be rightly interpreted by a hereditary imam believed to be a descendant of Muhammad through Ali. And many people did not know that a major school of Islam believes that all doctrine is essentially metaphoric and needs to be elucidated. So it's the imam alone vested with that authority to interpret religion. That authority supersedes even text. The imam's job is to reveal the text's inner meaning. Even Hajj and the structure of prayer itself through the day are fair game for interpretation. And this means that the Ismaili Muslims are able to adapt Islam in very interesting ways to changing times. Most recently, it means that the Ismaili vision of Islam is modern, pro-capitalist, and anti-fundamentalist itself. It also means that their vision of Islam is at fierce loggerheads with others, such as the Tabligis. These others have deemed Ismailism not Islam, a heretical, syncretic apostasy, and worth targeting with violence, with missionaries, and with narrative vitriol. I want to mark for a minute that this came tragically to life. You may know this, not 5 days ago, on Tuesday, when gunmen slaughtered a busload of Ismailis on their way to their house of worship, which is called a Jamaat Khana, and in which men and women worship together. Not that the assassins were necessarily of this Tablighi movement, but they express a common perspective with and emerge out of long associations with each other. The Ismailis are organized into a vast global network, very wealthy, consisting of an Indian and Indo-African diasporic elite and local indigenous enclaves in the Himalayas, Syria, and a few other areas. And again, Ismailis in northern Syria have been very much affected by the recent violence there. The Imamat, based in France, that's the directorate of the Ismaili community, provides a vast array of state-like services for Ismailis everywhere, but there's no territory. And the Ismailis are not without claim on some ownership of Muslim pasts and their material heritage, nor Muslim futures. Indeed, Ismailis essentially built Cairo under the Fatimid dynasty, and Al-Azhar, for example, one of Cairo's architectural treasures. So for this reason, under their current leader, they developed the Aga Khan Trust for Culture and the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, which recognizes, but also in some sense lays interesting claims of connection to certain Muslim treasures, one of which, it happens, is Nizamuddin. But the Aga Khan Foundation is just one player. In partnership with the city of Delhi and a certain consortium of global players, including national and multinational aid agencies, Nizamuddin is slated for a redo, a makeover, for reauthoring, to be more pleasing to the eye of a certain type of global visitor, to come into harmony with the image Delhi wants to have of itself, indeed to make Delhi able to become itself more pleasing, or to become more pleasing to the eye of that global visitor, and to be cleaned up of what is considered social dirt, to be regarded a world city, a competitor of a Singapore, a Dubai, but even a Mangalore or a Mumbai. And the purported motivator of this, either the mere justification for it or the real conceptual engine behind it, is the promotion of cultural heritage. I suspect that cultural heritage is just the thing the architects are saying it's about, but I can't quite get to what it really is about without a bit more digging. And even with digging, it's not clear actually what the real thing motivating this is. Why an urge to clean up a place defined by a righteous and blessed social mess at whose very heart is dirt, real dirt, poverty, and suffering, which would indeed not be the same thing at all without that. But still, most centrally, it is the Aga Khan Foundation that's going to do this, if it happens. The idea, the grand vision, is that Nizamuddin will become a well-curated, beautifully conserved cultural park. It will have areas for middle-class families to stroll and picnic. It will have interpretive centers, in its own words. It will have benign projects serving neighborhood kids. It will have, no joke, something people are calling a food court. It's just incommensurate. All this will be contiguous with a larger cultural heritage zone, incorporating the UNESCO site, the existing site at Humayun's tomb, in whose restoration the Aga Khan Foundation already played a key role, and the Sundar Nursery, which they're working on, which I won't go into right now. Informally, this zone also includes a pair of ultra-luxury hotels, the Delhi Land and Finance Lodi Hotel, formerly the Aman Resorts Delhi, starting around $1,000 a night for a room with your own pool, jolly lattice screen in the Islamic tradition, and a view of Nizamuddin, but not too close, and also the Oberoi Hotel in its own parkland alongside a vast golf course. I'll just let you look at the way the project is presented for a minute. This was a couple years ago in the Interpretive Center at Humayun's tomb to kind of showcase what was about to happen to Nizamuddin, to make it a more visitable place like Humayun's tomb, which is itself considered the precursor of the Taj Mahal. It is presented as a project involving and benefiting humans, so school improvement initiatives, with a certain Western bettering of the South behind that. Computer education, I can't actually remember what that says, something and dress program. English language for employability. You know, let's make the people of this neighborhood something else. But some obstacles are in the way of the human focus, even in the official materials, and those obstacles are also human. Look carefully. So yes, it is focused on human beings. Why be suspicious of this, you might be thinking, so what? Well, I had access to some materials for the use of which I have permission, which reveal some interesting and maybe hidden ideas and motives underlying the process. When I dug a bit deeper into planning reports, some of the language began to give me serious pause, even kind of trouble me. I'll let you look this over briefly, but point out some highlights. Some of the bolded words may show you what I mean. Families occupying the tomb must be relocated. Many areas are used for inappropriate activities that render their use as parks impossible. And immediately we come to the notion of perspective. Inappropriate to whom? Every effort will be made to identify a suitable space in close proximity to the basti for people aspiring for an improved lifestyle. If you don't aspire to an improved lifestyle, you're not in the club, man. Appropriate community use. Blah, blah, blah. An average Delhi resident does not know that the basti is a slum, and people are by and large ignorant of the cultural heritage located here. So already a certain type of this is truth and this other perspective is not is being posited here. Without the project, the basti will continue to lack. Basti is a Hindi word that means something between a neighborhood and a slum. It will continue to lack basic requirements for growth and be exploited for commercial interest of a small group of people. The monuments will continue to be lost. Again, that's being framed as primary. And in the years to come, it might be unlivable. The spiritual character for the zone outside the dargah is already lost. So we see a kind of moral privileging going on there. So I'm also troubled by this, not just because of the materials of the project itself, but because of other and bigger legacies. Because those legacies are also part of this. One of which is indicated by public feelings about slums and beggars and the institutional incarnations of those feelings. A report on beggary in the city of Delhi that I'm about to talk about, for example, commissioned by the city in advance of the disastrous Commonwealth Games, which themselves occasioned the clearance of massive slum areas, was written to tell the city what it wanted to hear about beggars, so they could round them up and out. Another, an academic like me, was commissioned to write a report that would be pleasing to the municipal authorities so they would feel okay about rounding up beggars and slum dwellers. So here is a slum cleared for the Commonwealth Games before and after. This was the same Commonwealth Games where the swimming competitors grew ill from the pool water. But it wasn't just the competitors, it was all the people who lived on that riverbank. They were completely cleared, and they were taken to resettlement zones, which are kind of like deportation nightmares that I don't have time to show you pictures of. But apparently this, which is again Nizamuddin, needs to go to have Delhi look the way it should. So another piece of this showdown of urban renewal, as it's called, and the human imperative comes from these public feelings about beggars. And that the report on beggars I just talked about is a good starting point. It at least gives a sense of the sorts of things motivating what's happening. And I'll just read you a few excerpts from the report. It says things like this. Listen carefully. Begging is a problem, it says, from every point of view. It is first a problem from the point of view of the beggar himself. It implies for him a life of squalor and filth, of need and disease, of ignorance and exploitation. Begging is as much a problem for the rest of society. A large number of beggars means non-utilization of available human resources, as also a drag upon the existing resources of our society. Beggars are also a public health problem. They are often carriers of infection and disease. Begging primarily is indicative of the absolute failure on the part of an individual to function effectively and in a normal way within the society of which he is an integral part. The beggars have their own ingenious way, it continues, of appealing for alms. Begging is an activity which needs to be discouraged as it has many evils. So there's not really like a pro-helping the beggars perspective here. So now the Nizamuddin people themselves are not quiet on all this. They formed an association expressing things like this. Quote, the objections of residents. The residents of Basti Hazrat Nizamuddin have strong objections to some of the provisions of the Memorandum of Understanding made between public parties and private parties. The MOU binds the public parties to relocate residents encroaching on government land or on open public spaces. Residents' comments. In Nizamuddin area, no official public meeting is held to discuss various problems of the residents and what they think to redress them. In Delhi itself, there are a number of colonies villages filled with historical sites and densely inhabited by poorer people too, so it is not fair to say this Basti is the worst area needing urgent attention to conserve heritage building. There is the sole motive of generating a huge revenue. They have their eyes set on money, say the residents of Nizamuddin. I tried to listen myself to what people say on the street too, an effort whose fruits I can't really bring to life here, but there's one passage. But in general, local people had a lot to say in the interviews for my project, and this included neighborhood residents, professionals, and otherwise of many social classes and beggars themselves who commented on what might happen to them and to the neighborhood in years to come. We know they are going to clean this entire area, and that doesn't mean sweep. They are saying that the Dargah's gate should be seen clearly from the other side of the main road. We have heard that all buildings on that street will be demolished. The Aga Khan doesn't come here to talk, but we get to know of these things from many other people. Why would the government listen to us? Even if the government won't demolish these directly, it will provide the machinery for the Aga Khan to do it, as in police efforts at fortifying the area. And finally, if you ask, what does the city of Delhi say, and what has it said about this kind of thing? Over many years, you will see, well, that the city of Delhi doesn't have a great track record on these counts, and actually many of the world's cities don't, including actually Honolulu. Pretty far back, though, for Delhi. Even well before the inauguration of the Delhi capital in 1931, they were clearing slums to make pleasure gardens. But further, not just pleasure gardens, to walk among old and well-preserved monuments without having to walk among the eyesore of the dwellings of the poor. This is Lodi Gardens, cleared of its slums in 1936, to make a park fashioned by and really for Lady Willingdon, who loved to walk there. She was the wife of the Governor General. Until 1947, from the time the villagers were cleared out, it was Lady Willingdon Gardens, so not altogether new, this process. So, let me take a stab at what's really going on here. I think a certain cadre, basically a coalition of interests, private and public, is coming together to try to turn something they've deemed an eyesore, like in Lodi Gardens in 1936, a tarnish on the canvas of an ever sleeker city, into a museum, basically, but a kind of living museum. This jewel, they argue, is being lost to shanties and slums and sewers. And they are, in some senses, of course, right, if all you consider is the condition of the stones. But they are also wittingly, sometimes, and unwittingly, other times, playing into a forceful campaign to erase the poor from the viewable city, to engineer culture and context so it looks just so. To be, ultimately, modern, which is part of an even larger campaign that centers around molding, fashioning a city at whose heart is consumption, monumentality, luxury, and spectacle of a hyper-modern sort, Olympics, gatherings of world leaders. I think most basically, Nizamuddin has become a poster child for the undesirability of the surviving remnants of what Delhi used to be, but no longer should be, in the planner's eyes, the perfect incarnation of what needs to change, what should not stick around. And it happens that that thing is Muslim. The very meaning of the place, both within and beyond a Muslim context, is the beggars, the poor, the noise, the tangled, ecstatic craze. So where do you go from there when the thing to be erased is the thing that forms the soul of the place, when two visions, not inherently contending, are now at loggerheads? In my abstract, if you read it, you might have seen it says I'll discuss how, quote, the tireless effort to produce the right sort of cities has imprinted itself upon a single neighborhood, and how the yearning for a sleek modernity renders certain Muslim spaces embodiments of a stagnant past. And I looked at that and I fretted for a minute, because, of course, I didn't mean that I think they actually render it a stagnant past. More that the people who see Nizamuddin as the kind of embarrassing eyesore, as I'm saying, that is keeping Delhi backwards, are casting it into that frame. The neighborhood, therefore, becomes the stagnant past that needs to be erased. The stagnant past, as I said, is tied to a certain mode of Islamic life and a certain image of Delhi as wed to that. Delhi held back by Muslim space, such as this. So it's a conundrum. We want to support conservation. Look at what's getting lost. 1200s, 1300s. We want to support and not evict people. I remember actually, not just 1200s, 1300s, but 7000 BC. I remember a picnic that my wife, who's here today, my wife and I took in Tajikistan, in the mountains, in a city called Penjikent that dated from 5000 BC, and it was just strewn with rubbish. So you think, this is a shame to lose like the ruins of one of the world's oldest cities. So we do want to support that conservation. We want to support also and not evict people. But here the two have been sort of put into friction. I don't know if they inherently are, as I said. Well, what if we didn't have to pick? I think the parties themselves have models they've maybe not thought of for how to allow both sides of the space to thrive. So here's the thing I want to think about, a workaround we might find if we really dug deep for a fix. Because, I don't want to say that lives are in the balance, but it's true that they are, because people are going to get moved. People's lives will change if this happens. The models and tools that might recast this whole thing, that might change its terms, are internally valent. And as an anthropologist, that's really important to me. That means that it's something that the parties involved might be able to use. It's not an either-or thing. It doesn't have to be. So it might be that the preservation and poverty, the conservation and chaos, could coexist quite nicely. Is there a local model for where this could go without the conflict riddling it now? An Islamic one, maybe. One involving the philosophies of the parties already involved. So I'll offer three proposals, one from one of the key parties' own innovations in the modern time, one from Islamic tradition, and one from the place in question. There are solutions to the problem to be pioneered, available from tools of the antagonist and protagonist landscape's own traditions. A first might come from the back of the view book for this very house, from Shangri-La, in collaboration with Omar Khayyam. There is a Muslim model of and for the park as something both full of people and well-preserved. In Islamic, or as Hodgson said, Islamicate visions of space through history, there's a very clear idea for how this would go. And I can't really actually see it on my screen very well. So it says, the handsome white border is the garden wall, protecting, preserving the park within for refuge and renewal, a magic space for concourse, music and rejoicing, for contemplation's lonely spell, conversation's grave, or lover's shy disclosure. And I think that's kind of fantastic. I was actually working on this one day a couple months ago, and as I was looking for signs that Doris Duke had herself been to Sufi shrines to include in my slides, and this was sitting on the table. Actually, this is the one that was sitting on the table. You might see my kid's fingerprints on it. It was sitting on the table, and I was like, wow, that's actually what my talk is about. Another idea comes right from the toolkit of one of the players. It just has to be reimagined and transposed. The Aga Khan Foundation already has a pre-existing model for community participation in the reimagining of life and space. It's called the Village Organization. Why not, I want to ask, apply the model of participatory rural development right here, a village model in the heart of Delhi? After all, Nizamuddin was and still somehow is a village. And it seems like the diverse mass of residents wants to speak together. So why not let them? Maybe the model isn't perfect. It has its critics in this part of Pakistan and Tajikistan where it's running, now Afghanistan too. Some say it's an alien form imposed locally, a kind of modern Euro-American democratic participation thing that's been pushed on local people. But it has worked so well in its time and place that NGOs have tried to copy it time and again. NGOs elsewhere in other countries, NGOs in Bangladesh, in East Africa. So it's kind of like the way the Grameen Bank became a blueprint for what was called development. This too has been both pirated and shared. People in these hallmark village organizations, and this was one of the very first ever in northern Pakistan, I think it was about 1982, envisioned themselves at the helm of what's going to happen to them. And what's going to happen to them in two senses. What's going to happen to them when this new organization comes and says, okay, $750,000 for you in Pakistani rupees to do whatever you want. So that's what's going to happen to them organizationally. Someone's going to show up and give money, and they're going to be tied to this organization. But also what's going to happen to them anyway, which is things are going to change fast. China has just put, for example, billions of dollars into Pakistan. There already, since the early 1980s, even late 70s in some places, has been a road connecting northern Pakistan and far western China. Things have changed radically, even if the villagers had to be strafed with fighter jets to get subdued to let the road be built. But in any case, when and if resources for better or changes for worse come their way, then people do feel at the helm of what's going to happen. They feel, for want of a less overused word, empowered. They have a say. It is, after all, a way to privilege both people and preservation. And that's the predicament I'm talking about today. And it's right there in their own toolkit to be deployed. But the folks from northern Pakistan who set this up haven't really come to Delhi to set that up. And they probably should. And finally, I'm starting to wrap up here. One of the reasons to engage slum dwellers in what happens to this space is to honor the social justice commitments of Nizamuddin himself from 800 years ago and of his peers. We can find a solution in the place itself if we draw from the most local history we have at our disposal. It need not be either or, either the beggar or the park, either the food court or the butcher's blood. Ask the poor who line in wait and wait in line at the cauldron how to preserve the tomb for the next century and beyond. Ask them why they inhabit this space above others. Have them give their insights. This place is beloved to none more than them, and they are beloved to this place. And in that way, a possibility comes alive where the solution is in the genesis of the place, the commitment to the poor in its very beginnings. And in this notion, everything comes full circle. The elements of the shrine, seen initially as undesirable for conservation, become the core engine to be used to drive it. And that leaves us extra time for questions. Thank you.